Thanks very much. So I have a big task to try to discuss age-related changes in macronutrient and energy requirements. So I'll take much of what has already been presented as a given that I won't have to really define or discuss much. We all can know this. This is kind of the combination of sarcopenia and sarcopenic obesity. These are the cross-sections of the thighs of two women who were subjects in my laboratory. The top was a 21-year-old female graduate student. The bottom was a 63-year-old woman who came to participate in a study to examine the effects of diet and exercise on insulin action. But you can see these two women had the same body mass index, but a really astonishing difference in body composition with a remarkable difference in muscle and an equally as remarkable increase in fat. And then the real important feature here is that while in this muscle there's not very much fat in the muscle itself, in this woman there is a quite remarkable amount. We know now that that's not such a good thing, and these are data from the Health ABC study that probably many of you are familiar with, that was able to get CT scans from a very large group of elderly people that were recruited for that study. And they could look at the attenuation score using Hounsfield units. And what you can see here is that as body mass index goes up, the attenuation, the attenuation score goes down, and that means an increasing amount of fat. And the same thing is true with aging, is that with increasing aging, there is an increase in intramyocellular fat. Now, one of the interesting components of this study is that we had always assumed that cross-sectional area was related to force production, but in this study, the amount of fat in the muscle, when controlled for cross-sectional area, also significantly affected force production. So again, low attenuation score means a lot of fat, and you can see women have more intramyocellular fat than men do, but this intramyocellular fat actually significantly affects force production and functional status. So we have this notion that Luigi talked about, that fat mass is a powerful predictor of disability. And while I won't go into the details of this study because the title actually tells you what their conclusion was, fat mass rather than muscle strength is the major determinant of physical function and disability in postmenopausal women younger than 75. And showing that there's a strong adverse effect of fat mass that does not seem to be compensated by the observed parallel increases in leg muscle mass. Now you can see that perhaps better with this also is cross-sectional data from the Health ABC study. And as we know, increasing BMI is associated with increasing fat. Now in younger people, increasing BMI is also associated with increasing amount of muscle mass. We assume that about a third of weight gain is muscle mass, but what you can see in older people, this is in older women, is that as fatness goes up, there is not a concomitant increase in muscle mass or lean body mass. So fundamentally, 100% of the weight gain is fat. And these investigators also demonstrated that weight loss in this population is associated with about 50% of the weight loss from lean body mass. So 100% of the weight gain is fat, 50% of the weight loss is lean. Now, one of the issues that I want to really try to get at is what perhaps is going on here. Well, one of the things that we observed some years ago when I was at the Nutrition Center was that when we put healthy older people on the US RDA for protein of 0.8 grams per kilogram per day, they would remain in negative nitrogen balance. And this was almost every person over the age of 60, whether they were men or women, they were in negative nitrogen balance. And that strongly indicated that the RDA was probably inadequate to maintain nitrogen balance among older people. So we did a study to determine what the consequences of long-term adherence to the recommended dietary allowance would be. So we put a group of healthy older people on the RDA for 3 months. So this was a real nitrogen balance study. We controlled all of their diet for 3 consecutive months. And what you can see here is we measured muscle mass before and after using CT scan, and there was a significant loss of skeletal muscle mass in just 3 months of adherence to the RDA while consuming a eukcaloric diet. So they did not reduce their dietary intake of energy, maintain their body weight, but still on the RDA lost muscle. Now there have been a couple of other, this is again data from the Health ABC study examining longitudinally dietary protein intake versus changes in lean body mass over time. And this is looking at quintiles of protein intake from 0.7 grams per kilo day to 1.1 grams of protein per kilo day. Actually not a very wide spread in dietary protein intake, but what you can see is that the lower the dietary protein intake, the greater the loss of lean mass. And their conclusion was that dietary protein may be a modifiable risk factor for sarcopenia in older adults. Now, more recently, as we try to kind of get at this, we know that there is described by some investigators what's called anabolic resistance to dietary protein that comes with aging. And this is an interesting study that was just published looking at stimulation of myofibrillar protein synthetic rate and looking at both younger and older men. And what you can see is that in older people, it takes more protein to get to this inflection point of protein synthetic rate than in younger people. This is per kilogram body weight, this is per kilogram lean body mass. Fundamentally, the conclusion is that to get the same rate of muscle protein synthesis, it takes more protein in older people than in younger people. Now, this anabolic resistance is not clear. There has been some speculation that it may involve mTOR signaling in muscle. This is an interesting study looking at blood flow with insulin and drugs that stimulate or inhibit blood flow. So again, the method is looking at muscle protein synthesis. And so we can see basally there's less blood going to the muscle in older people than in younger people, but basal protein synthetic rates are almost the same. When you stimulate insulin production, we know that insulin is a powerful vasodilator, and insulin stimulates blood flow in young people, which is the open circles, and in older people it doesn't, and you can see that there is a concomitant increase in muscle protein synthesis that does not seem to be matched very well in older people. If you give supraphysiological levels of insulin, you can increase muscle protein synthesis. If you use LMMA, you can inhibit blood flow and decreased protein synthetic rate. So their conclusion that much of the anabolic resistance that's associated with the decreased anabolic response to nutrition may be poorly controlled or reduced blood flow to the muscle itself. Now, obviously, we are facing what I think is almost an existential problem as the baby boom generation enters old age with higher amounts of body fat and an ever increasing amount of body fat. So obviously there are two perhaps strategies to deal with this. One is to prevent the change, and we all know how good the United States is at that. And the other one is to stimulate weight loss. And I have to say, there is a lot of controversy about whether or not older people should lose weight. This was, again, an observational study looking at weight loss versus bone density, looking at what they called intentional or unintentional weight loss, which increases bone loss. So they looked at those that lost weight. They looked at those that were weight stable and those that gained weight. The women who lost weight lost the greatest amount of bone density over the 5.7 years of observation. And their conclusion was older women who experience weight loss in later years have increased rates of hip bone loss and a twofold greater risk of subsequent hip fracture, irrespective of current weight or intention to lose weight. That even voluntary weight loss in overweight elderly women increase hip fracture risk. And Johanna showed some of these data, but I think it's really important. We are facing, in the United States and most Western countries, an ever-increasing obesity epidemic. But what you can see from these data is that it is largely in elderly people and largely in elderly women. And so you can look at ages, but in the women above the age of 60, the mean BMI is 42. Again, we haven't done great at prevention. Now, these are some data from my laboratory. Unfortunately, it didn't translate well from my Mac to this. This is looking at, this is looking at of total energy expenditure, what percentage of that energy expenditure is basal metabolic rate. So everybody's at 100% here. So if we look at 23-year-old athletes, you can see that this is, what about 10, 20, 30, almost 40%. In 57-year-old athletes, you can see is about 43%. In sedentary 23-year-olds, BMR occupies about 50% of total energy expenditure. In sedentary 70-year-olds, about 55%. And in our nursing home studies, in sedentary, there's not too many really active 90-year-olds, but in sedentary 90-year-olds in a nursing home, basal metabolic rate is fully 82% of total daily energy expenditure. So you can see reduction of energy intake to lose weight becomes an enormous challenge for older people. Now, one of the things you may say, well, of course, exercise will increase energy expenditure, but that's not always a safe assumption. It's a paper published many years ago, but I still like to use it. And actually, a number of subsequent studies have shown the same thing. So this is a study in healthy elderly people, putting them on a really brisk exercise program, 1 hour a day, 5 days a week. And before they started their exercise program, they measured their total daily energy expenditure using doubly labeled water, and it was about 2,400 calories a day. After 3 months of exercising, while they were still exercising, they remeasured total daily energy expenditure, and guess what? It was 2,400 calories a day. It was absolutely unchanged. So an hour of exercise a day didn't change daily energy expenditure. Why would that be? Well, if we look at what they call extra exercise physical activity, or everything else you do besides the exercise itself, it was reduced. And we now know that many people who exercise, especially those that start an exercise program, compensate for their exercise by becoming less active. Remember, as Luigi said, we have an amount of energy that we spend every day, and we can decide how to spend that. So exercising in the morning doesn't necessarily mean that everything else is going to be exactly the same, and we know that that's not true. They reported that they were napping more in the afternoon, sleeping better at night, and you do the same thing. You know, if you go out and exercise, I don't need to go for a walk today, or you take out the trash, I've done my exercise. We do tend to compensate, and there are a number of studies that show that, so that while exercise is great, it doesn't necessarily affect total daily energy expenditure. Now, one of the things I do want to talk about is kind of shifting macronutrient intake to see if we can change daily calorie balance. And one of the things that we do know is that all foods have a thermic effect. We know that the food that has the less, or the macronutrient that has the lowest thermic effect is fat. We know that the macronutrient that has the highest thermic effect is protein. And of that, whey protein has the highest thermic effect. So this is really just looking at meal consumption of whey, casein, soy, and carbohydrate. They all have a thermic effect. Whey protein has the highest thermic effect. So we did a series of studies where we looked at changing macronutrient intake with no other real intervention. When we ask our elderly, overweight people just to write down and record what they eat, this is kind of the composition of their diet, about 48% carbohydrate, about 35% fat, about 15% protein. We shifted their diet to a 60% carb, 20% fat, 20% protein diet. So our hypothesis was that simply shifting macronutrient intake away from fat will produce weight loss. So we had 3 different diets: a control diet, which was 40% fat, 40% carbs, 20% protein, high carbohydrate diet, and high carbohydrate plus exercise. Now, the way that we did this study is we had a metabolic ward. Our metabolic kitchen made all of their food. We gave them 150% of the energy that they needed to maintain their weight. So we said, eat however much food you want. We weighed all of their food before and after each day, so we knew what their macronutrient and total energy intake actually was. We didn't tell anybody that this was a weight loss study. We told them simply that this was a study to look at the effects of a heart-healthy diet on risk of diabetes. So what happened? Well, we saw no change in energy intake in any group, and no difference in energy intake at the completion. So it didn't matter what the diet was, they were all consuming the same amount of energy. We had a complex carbohydrate diet and a simple carbohydrate diet. It didn't matter. A high carbohydrate, high protein diet ad libitum produced about a pound of weight loss a week in elderly people with a higher risk of, with impaired glucose tolerance, essentially. Now, we knew that they weren't intentionally restricting their calorie intake because there was no change in resting metabolic rate. We also measured glucose disposal rates using a euglycemic glucose clamp, and as a result of the weight loss, there was a significant increase in glucose disposal, indicating a reduced risk of diabetes. So a simple shift in macronutrient intake resulted in a significant change in insulin action. And we weren't the first to show that. You know the results from the Women's Health Initiative Dietary Modification trial, which fundamentally was advised to decrease fat and increase fruit and grain intake. The women in the intervention group lost an average of 2.2 kilograms and importantly maintained that lower weight for about 7.5 years. And the weight loss was greatest among women in either group who decreased their percent energy from fat. And you know that George Bray published a very nice retrospective look at these data and showed that the mean weight change over 7 years, it was strongly related to only dietary fat intake. And the greater the restriction in dietary fat intake over time, the greatest amount of weight loss. And I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to show you a little bit about our bed rest studies, which you're probably very familiar with. We were very interested in the effects of 10 days of complete bed rest in elderly people. We put them on a eukcaloric diet and providing, again, the RDA for protein. And this is what happens when you put young people to bed for 28 days. This is what happens when you put old people to bed for 28 days. They lost more than 1 kilo of muscle just from their legs. Enormous change in a very short period of time. And it all resulted from a decrease in the rate of muscle protein synthesis. And what you can see here, and this is maybe the important point, is that even before bed rest, we looked at nitrogen balance on a eukcaloric diet, consuming the RDA. They were in negative nitrogen balance. And then even though they were consuming a eukcaloric diet, the RDA for protein was absolutely inefficient and ineffective at maintaining muscle mass. They went into profoundly negative nitrogen balance during that 10-day period. And we did a subsequent study where we supplemented them with a cocktail of essential amino acids. This, again, are the data that I just showed you on a change in protein synthetic rate. And you can see if we maintain an intake of essential amino acids, there was no real reduction in rate of protein synthesis. And you can see this is what their nitrogen balance looked like. So the last thing I just want to show you is a new method that we have to measure muscle mass, because what has limited the field, I have to say, in many ways, is our inability to measure how much muscle is in a human being. We have a number of tools that are, in fact, indirect at best. They don't measure muscle mass directly. We published a validation study a few months ago, and the idea here is that 98% of all the creatine in your body is in muscle. But muscle doesn't make creatine. It's made in the liver and the kidney and pumped into muscle against a large concentration gradient. So we can give a small 30 milligram dose of deuterated creatine. It is digested, distributed to all muscles. And then the beauty of creatine is that its turnover is determined by conversion, an irreversible conversion to creatinine and lost in urine. So the idea here is we give a single oral dose of 30 milligrams of creatine, and then we sample urine. And pretty simple, we can look at the creatinine enrichment in urine and know exactly how much muscle you have. So our initial validation study looks like this. This is our method compared to whole body MRI, which is thought to be kind of the gold standard for looking at muscle mass. Correlation looks good, and importantly, it falls right along the line of identity, indicating that they're both actually measuring the same thing. This is what our method looks like against DEXA. DEXA overpredicts muscle mass. It doesn't measure muscle mass fundamentally. It measures something else. It measures lean mass, but not muscle specifically. So the idea is that For naive subjects, it's a very simple. You take a pill and produce a urine sample. Peggy Cawthon now has incorporated this method into the Mr. Oz trial. We just received a large grant from the Gates Foundation to validate our method in neonates and infants and children as an indicator of nutrition status in children. Muscle mass perhaps is the single best indicator of nutrition status. So in conclusion, dietary protein requirement increases with age, and that is almost secondary to reduced testosterone, estradiol levels, growth hormone levels, IGF-1, physical activity, and the so-called anabolic resistance. Dietary energy intakes are also substantially lower, and I think that weight loss strategies must focus on how we best maintain muscle and bone, and that's not an easy task. I think that is one of the major tasks ahead of us. The amount of obesity among elderly people is increasing, and we're not preventing it. So how do we treat it? That is really one of the most important issues, I think, facing us as researchers and health practitioners. Perhaps a shift in macronutrient intake away from fat increases thermogenesis and total daily energy expenditure, but it should be a very high priority. And finally, we were asked to kind of define successful aging, but I found this wonderful quote from Shakespeare that did it extremely well. I mean, we don't have to do it. So, and I found this when I had to speak along with John Glenn. I thought, what am I going to say? And I found this described him well. So Shakespeare wrote, "Though I look old, yet I am strong and lusty." So it doesn't matter how I look, I'm really still strong. For in my youth I never did apply hot and rebellious liquors in my blood. So we all know that maybe a little too much of the liquors could lead to debility, nor did not with unbashful forehead woo the means of weakness and debility. Doesn't know what they are, but he avoided them. Therefore my age is as a lusty winter, frosty but kindly. Let me go with you, I'll do the service of a younger man in all your business and necessities. So my age doesn't matter. I can still do everything that you ask me to do. So with that, I'll finish, and happy to answer any questions.